Mr. Speaker, sir, I beg to move that this House has no confidence in Her Majesty's government. The timing of the motion, Mr. Speaker, arises from the government's inept handling of the results of the referendum on the Scotland and Wales Acts. When we thought it was a time for decision, the Prime Minister thought it was a time for talks. As he'd previously spurned them, we were not wholly convinced that the reasons he advanced represented the whole truth. And we were similarly sceptical when he expressed his willingness to consider modifications to the present Act, presumably by an amending bill, or a totally different measure. From his days as Home Secretary, we know that the Right Honourable Gentleman takes what might be charitably described as a flexible view of constitutional niceties. But even he might find it difficult to arrange for major changes on a subject like this to pass through all their stages in the 3 working months at most which are left to this House. Any such changes must be for a new Parliament. The only decision the Prime Minister really took was to delay a decision. And for reasons which I find difficult to understand, Mr. Speaker, such momentous delays seem these days to be accompanied by a ministerial broadcast. The good government of the United Kingdom and its unity is a matter of supreme importance to this House, wherever we may sit. The new proposals are not for a dying Parliament, but for a new one. Mr. Speaker, the essence of the motion this afternoon is that the government has failed the nation, that it's lost credibility, and that it is time for it to go. Unless the Prime Minister should advance his customary explanation of failure, namely his political inheritance, may I point out that his and this government's inheritance was from a Labour government led by the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Huyton. This Parliament was elected in October 1974. By then, Labour had been in office for 7 months. They'd plenty of time to assess the economic state of the country. The election of October 1974 gave them the opportunity to state it clearly. They did. The Chancellor claimed inflation was down to 8.4% on his chosen basis. Later, when it went soaring up, how did he explain it? Not by any talk about the previous Conservative government's policies. That excuse hadn't been invented. On BBC Radio 4 Analysis in October 1976, the Chancellor said, "I think it's fair to say that inflation went up much more after the October election than I or anyone else expected, because the trades unions didn't at the time observe the social contract as they'd defined it earlier in the year." Indeed, when the Chancellor was pressed, he stressed the point and went even further. "I think it's fair to say," he said, "that wage inflation was the main reason for the runaway inflation in the months that followed the October 1974 election." Nor was it only inflation that had been beaten by October 1974, according to the then government. The Chancellor said on the 24th of September, after 6 months in office, "I am certain we can get through the whole of next year with well under 1 million unemployed." Not only did he not get through 1975 with under 1 million unemployed, he did not get through 1976 or 1977 or 1978. So it's no good the Prime Minister now saying that the disasters since October 1974 were the fault of the Conservative government. In October 1974, the Labour government took full responsibility for the state of the economy. But then, of course, Mr. Speaker, let us be fair to the previous Prime Minister. He was prepared to take responsibility. But let us take the Prime Minister's own objectives as the tests by which he should be judged. He set them out in the first censure debate, which took place in June 1976. His first objective was to overcome inflation. Apparently, the Chancellor of the Exchequer had not performed that feat by the time the last election took place. Be that as it may, the fact is that this government has been responsible for doubling the prices in the housewife's shopping basket. Now, far from being overcome, inflation is rising again and will rise for the coming months. Indeed, on the Healy basis, it is already into double figures. And it was on that basis that the Treasurer gave us the figure 13.3%. The Prime Minister's second objective was to make inroads into the unacceptably high level of unemployment and to reduce it by 1979, this was in 1976, to 3%. Today it is double that figure. On that, too, the Prime Minister has failed. And his third objective, to achieve a high output, high productivity, high wage economy based on full employment. But only a week or so ago, we had news of the worst level of manufacturing output this decade. And a few days ago, we had a chilling reminder that not only are our industrial competitors ahead of us in output, but they are pulling away from us at what seems an ever faster rate. For every extra unit of output from a worker in British industry over the last 5 years, our least efficient competitor, the Italians, produced 2, the Americans more than 3, the French 4.5, the Germans 5.5, and the Japanese more than 6. In the same world conditions as we face, their governments seem to be able to generate the conditions for success. This government has failed. Those were the Prime Minister's objectives. His strategy was the social contract, and then a new social contract to enable us to proceed with confidence in the years ahead. That strategy has totally collapsed, as many of us thought it would, but we were regularly vilified for saying so. The fourth phase of that contract, the 5%, was never accepted by those for whom it was intended. It resulted in creating the very confrontation that the Prime Minister boasted he had replaced by cooperation. And the people witnessed the spectacle of a government abdicating its authority to strike committees. So the Prime Minister's objectives were not achieved, and his strategy failed. Had his dream of new economic strength come about, the Prime Minister said he would use it to strengthen our position abroad, to ensure a peaceful solution to world problems through the use of the United Nations, and to strengthen Europe's voice. And the reality, rarely in the post-war period can our standing in the world have been lower or our defences weaker. The international position is graver than at any time since the 1930s. The difference is that Britain is now a nation on the sidelines. In one diagnosis, however, I agree with the Prime Minister. Influence overseas depends on economic strength at home, and a nation which can't manage its own affairs properly is not in a position to give advice to those who can. Mr. Speaker, there are, I believe, 4 main things which have contributed to Britain's decline in the last 5 years. First, far too little attention has been given to wealth creation and far too much to wealth distribution. So what has to be done? Top of the list must be a policy of incentive tax cuts. There's widespread agreement on this. There has been for years. The trouble is the government just doesn't do it. The Chancellor of the Exchequer has sympathy with the tax position of management, but sympathy is as far as it goes. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, the government's resident example of congenial and civilized man, is much more expansive. In a television interview, he said, "The rate of tax on salaried talent is very high in this country. The putting of this right is a massive problem that will take a little time. I believe this to be a #1 priority in the Chancellor's mind for future action. That's my own view. It ought to be." But nothing was done. Even the Prime Minister tells his colleagues, if you talk to people in the factories and in the clubs, they all want to pay less tax. But pronouncement is not followed by policy. And lack of that policy leads to a hemorrhage of talent in management and a resentment amongst the skilled. The Jeremiahs sometimes say that the ordinary people of this country have lost the will to work. But let them work in other countries where they're no longer frustrated by British tax rates and they can outproduce and outsell our competitors. Vital as tax cuts are to restore management morale and that of the skilled worker, they're also needed to encourage the growth of small business. Because it's mainly from that sector that we shall get the new jobs, tomorrow's jobs that we need for our young people. Now, no government can protect yesterday's jobs forever. It can postpone the day of reckoning, but it cannot escape it. It can ease the transition from one job to another. But this government tries to protect yesterday's jobs without facilitating the growth of new industries. That's a policy for penury and unemployment, in which the regions suffer most of all. For wealth creation, a different attitude to profits is also required. Profits are pitifully low, and as a result, several companies have announced cutbacks in investment plans, ICI and Hoover, for example. The alternative of borrowing to invest is precluded for many businesses by the continuing prohibitive interest rates, which are the consequences of this government's policies. All our hopes for better homes for families, for better schools for our children, for better pensions for retirement, for better health service, all of them depend for their fulfillment on our ability to create the wealth to pay for these things. Fail in that, and we fail in all the other things. The government has failed, and the social services of other nations have consequently overtaken ours. That, I believe, is the first reason for the decline. The second reason is that the government has concentrated far too much power in the hands of the centralized state and left too little with the individual citizen. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, if the government had assumed less power over communities and individuals, the remoter areas in the United Kingdom would have less reason to worry about the power coming from Westminster. Although socialism is about centralized planning and control, even some members of Her Majesty's government have from time to time begun to have doubts about the wisdom of the policy. A former distinguished member, the late Anthony Crossland, in a lecture in October 1975 said, "But we must take seriously the fears about the growth of state power, especially given the penchant of some socialists for the continual spawning of giant new institutions under centralized control." He continued, "We should not be in the business of creating giant leviathans manned by armies of bureaucrats." What a pity he and his colleagues did not take his advice. It was added to by the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, who said in Birmingham this year, "We have to acknowledge that the decentralized private sector has outperformed the old-fashioned concepts of centralized planning." But of course, Such wisdom marks him out as a man who the left must try to oust from his own constituency. But his views are ours, and we believe they're in tune with the nation. Not, however, with the actions of this government. For centralisation continues and